Today on Context, confronting the problem of racism in Canada. Hey, Sheldon. Good to see you. Good to see you. Wow, we are going to be discussing the problem of racism today, and this has been your show to produce.
Yes, it has. It's been a very riveting experience, something that I'm familiar with. I've experienced personally racism in the classroom while growing up, so doing this topic was something that had a personal connection in it as well. Yeah.
And then we talked, as we do behind the scenes, that you should host this one, Sheldon. You should be the guy in charge of this one.
Yes.
And you said, Lorna, I don't think so.
That's right.
What were you thinking?
Well, you know, I think in short, and I think it can come across to audiences watching as the typical card to play that, you know, we're tackling a racism show or racial issues, so let's have someone from that group be the front person for it, that face for that show. And I see the validity in that in terms of if you're from that cultural background or racial background, why not lead the forefront of that? But I believe there's a way we can step a step further than that and say, you know what, let's invite others to the table. I really believe that there's different perspectives, not in those who just received it or have been lived through it, but on the other side, what perspective, what fresh questions are there to ask? I believe with racial healing, all communities must be involved in it. And I think it's fresh when you're turning the channel and you don't just see the familiar cultural face asking the questions or trying to seek healing, but the other side saying something is wrong, how do we solve it? When that starts, I believe we're on a good journey.
Okay, so it's better for my race to advance the education here, right, on this one.
I believe it's much more telling to generations who have passed and to come that, you know what, we are stepping forward or reaching across the aisle and trying to understand what went wrong and how can we move forward positively.
Every generation has to address our past sins on racism. So thank you from a younger generation. Teaching me how to address this. We're honored to take your episode, and you'll see a little more of Sheldon later in the show, okay? You're not disappearing completely.
Not completely.
But you've booked a special guest for us, so earlier I spoke with Calvin Quarles. He's been fighting against racism since his days with the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, but he's a Christian minister now who moved into care when 9 Black people were shot and killed in a church Bible study in Charleston, South Carolina. So we asked Pastor Quarles how to make sense of the race-related shootings and violence across the U.S.
It really has been a year that has been quite challenging, I think, particularly for the church. I think the church has really had some issues that it has to address. The African-American community in America has really been in just turmoil, you know, in regards to it. So it has really pushed to the extreme, those things and decisions and questions that are being asked. I see things happening now among friends and family and conversations that you've never heard before.
What are those? What are those issues that have been pushed to the front through this year
some
of
of those
racial?
conversations are really about when's it going to stop? How do we address this? What is it that we need to do? Do I need to have personal protection? Do I need to purchase a gun of my own? You know, what's happening anytime a police officer is going to pull you over and stop you? What's going to be the issue, you know, regarding that? You know, we even have concerns about now when someone comes into the church and you've got somebody walking into the church and you want to welcome them. And now you've got people that are saying to you, Pastor, you know, you really need to be cautious. And so you've got security guards that want to try and cover you as you're going to talk to someone, and they're watching and observing. And so it really has been a challenge.
In Charleston, South Carolina, we have 21-year-old Dylan Roof facing hate crime charges. Alleged he stood up during a Bible study group at Emmanuel AME, opened fire. Roof is now charged with killing 9 people. What went through your mind when you heard the news of that tragedy?
It really came to me initially as a surprise. I had not heard it on that Wednesday night when it occurred. I was talking with some friends on that Thursday morning. I went to the office of a friend and I was standing there talking to her, and she says, Cal, have you heard what happened last night in Charleston? And I said, well, no, I've not heard. And she says, well, let me bring this up. And she went to her computer and brought it up. And we both sat there and wept as I heard what had taken place and how tragic it was. So I was really devastated. And just in that very moment, she turned to me right then and said, "Cal, it's time. Something's got to be done. It's time to stop."
You talked to your church there in the Chicago area, and you actually got on a plane and you went as a representative of one community to another community.
Yes.
Why, and what did you do once you got to Charleston?
Well, I initially went as a result of hearing the, on that Friday night following the shooting, when those families were confronted in the courtroom. And they were there, and I heard them as the judge was asking the questions of, Dylan and what have you. When these families began to extend love and forgiveness, talked about their pain and how serious their pain was and how they had been hurt by it, but yet they were going to forgive him and extend their kindness and love towards him, it caused me to stop and think, okay, something different happened. That was not what the city of Charleston was expecting. That's not what America was expecting. And so to see that happen got my attention immediately, and I just began to pray, all right, God, what is it that I can do?
Let's go to Pastor Pickney's vision that
Yes.
you feel was under assassination attempt.
Yes.
What was that vision?
Well, the first thing that I discovered just in meeting with some of the members of the congregation is that this whole idea of love and forgiveness was something that he was really pushing and something that he just believed in for the community and for the church. He had been really wrestling with the issues, and they've been struggling with some of the gun control issues and wanting to put some stop to what was taking place. Charleston, like most of our nation, has really been dealing with that question, and so he was really fighting that issue. But I think the primary thing that he was fighting for was for his immediate community. He was fighting for employment, raising the employment level. Charleston was booming with construction, but yet he wasn't seeing the African-American community nor the local church having that much of an impact on it, and people weren't getting hired. So he was doing that kind of battle for them. He was also fighting because he was the state senator as well, he was also fighting at that level to bring about a change in the laws related to hiring practices, making sure that people were getting treated properly. So he really had a social justice agenda and not just an agenda for the church.
We'll continue our conversation with Calvin Quarles later in the program, but let's turn to Canada now. Winnipeg has recently completed a national summit designed to combat the problem of racism in Canada. Treaty Commissioner James Wilson was a presenter at the summit, and he joins us from Winnipeg. Hi, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
I think you should start by reminding us why we have treaty commissioners and what are we talking about when we talk about being in a treaty relationship with your people?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially for people outside of the Prairie provinces. So a treaty commission, we're an independent federal agency, and I'm the head of that agency, but it's really unique in that I report both to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs federally and to the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. So our office is unique in that we're created through this contemporary partnership between the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the federal government. And we're not talking about a relationship that's it's not always on the best of terms. So the fact that our office exists is a real positive step forward.
What progress do you feel as an Aboriginal leader was made at that summit in Winnipeg?
I thought it was a really good step. I mean, it's easy afterwards when somebody takes a real bold step forward like the mayor did. It's real easy to say yes, but. And I think it's important that we take what the mayor did and say yes, and. So it's important that we say, okay, we started this dialogue, and now what's next?
Can we address yes, but? Because as we checked into Winnipeg, here is an underlying sentiment that I think is racist, but we hear it coast to coast, and that is that the payments and the obligations made to equalize Aboriginal life in Canada are already excessive and they should be stopped. That's a racist attitude that just exists. What's your reaction?
There's a lot of Canadians that don't understand our collective history, and the more Canadians understand that the role that First Nations have played in contributing to the development of Canada, like if you look at the Prairie provinces, the 11 numbered treaties, the area between Manitoba and British Columbia could have easily become part of the United States. It allowed Sir John Macdonald at the time of Confederation to unite the country. And First Nations all across the country have really played a foundational role in creating the country, both in its physical sense and in our psyche as a country nationally. If you buy into the concept of soft power, First Nations have really influenced Canadian psyche really since the time of first contact.
So what does reconciliation and harmony look like in this generation?
If we invest in the young people across Canada, and we've seen it here in Manitoba where we've had young students, I'll give you an example, a young guy named Alex Knott, who the more he learned, he's a young Aboriginal guy, his best friend Chris is non-Aboriginal. The more he learned about our collective history and about the treaties and about his role in Canada, the more engaged he became, and the more he said, I want to take responsibility for this relationship. I'm not going to leave this up to the national chief or the prime minister. I'm going to take responsibility, and the first thing I can do is learn about my partner. And we're seeing in Manitoba that the young people taking responsibility for this relationship and saying the more they learn about their partner in the relationship, whether it's First Nations learning about non-First Nations or the other way around, the more actively engaged they become as citizens and the more vested they become in the relationship overall.
Hey, Treaty Commissioner James Wilson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
When we return, narrowing down solutions to the problem of racism in Canada. But first, our own Sheldon Neal speaks out on racial stereotypes that so often divide us. Take a look.
I'm black, but I'm not just into wearing baggy clothes. I'm black, but I'm not in trouble with the law. I'm black, but I don't have bad credit. I'm black, but I'm not having a tough time in school. I'm black, but I'm not just, into basketball. I'm black, but I'm not into using words like yo or whatever word you might have heard the latest artist say. I'm black, but I'm not whitewashed just because I'm well-spoken. I'm black, but I'm not fathering a child to a woman I haven't yet married. I'm black, and I make it my business to manage my finances well and steward all things that God has given unto me. I'm black, and yes, I do play basketball, but watch this. I'm also into soccer, tennis, badminton, and I'm about to try curling, just 10 minutes down the street from my house. I'm black, and I believe in speaking proper English and yes, using proper grammar. And if by chance you hear me use words like yo, well, it's because I felt like it. I'm black, and I'm married to the most beautiful woman on this earth, and yes, I'm a proud father to my beautiful daughter. Any questions? You see, today we put a stop to all racial profiling, discrimination, and all manner of perspective that moves us away from becoming one community. You see, today we desire to move together in relationship without any strings attached or judgments. Today we commit ourselves to live in a society, a time, a place where we, as the good book encourages us, to love our neighbor as ourselves.
We're back, tackling a Canadian response to racism within our borders. Please welcome Anita Bromberg of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and welcome Gwen Chapman of the Canadian Black Caucus. So what do you have in place at the Race Relations for keeping it, for keeping a check on this when we get...
Well, the solutions lie in basic rules. When racism happens, we all should stand up and say, not in our backyard. When it doesn't matter what community you're part of, we're all Canadians when racism happens. And that's where the check comes. If you see racism happening and no one's standing up to it, then that's the warning sign. The good news is, and you might call me a bit of a realistic optimist a bit on this, is that Canadians do stand up and object. So I don't think we're at the line where when we have to say that racism is out of hand. When a mosque gets graffitied and people...
when a pregnant woman in a niqab gets bullied.
Right, we object,
Yeah.
and so the bullies have to be cornered and isolated. At the Race Relations Foundation, we believe that we have to get in front of the dialogue.
Each generation is left with ideas that long outlive the people who started them. How does a new generation tackle racism of the past?
Wow, that's a very interesting question, and I think first of all, we have to understand that we're all part of the human race, and I believe that collectively, as a community, as a country, the culture has to change in that we recognize ourselves in each other, and we try to understand people who may look different, who may come from a different background. We really have to work on, teaching a little bit more in terms of being our brother's keeper, being more compassionate, and again, seeing ourselves in other people's, in other people's eyes, in other people's shoes.
We haven't seen a racism summit, Anita, like the one that was just recently in Winnipeg and in such an iconic building, the Human Rights Museum. What did you feel happened there that will help this kind of future that Gwyn talks about?
Well, I mean, it's part of our strategy, right? We believe that we're going to fight racism, we're going to build social cohesion through having shared dialogues around values, putting the values into practice by first identifying them, then talking about them, and then finding the practical solutions. The one summit, the mayor was to be commended because when his city was labeled as the most racist city, he reached out to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, to local leaders, and said, you know what, I'm going to do something about it. Whether the label is just or not, there is racism in my city, and we're not going to stand for it. So he brought people together to start the dialogue, talking about the issues and trying, particularly in the final panel, which we helped put together, to look at solutions.
And Gwyn, you've been working a lot with young people. What solutions are you finding?
Well, one of the things I think is very promising is that a lot of the younger generation, they have friends who come from different backgrounds. And so the young people are starting to understand and get to know each other. And they seem to be forming alliances because they see, again, themselves in their friends, and the building of relationships between the people of different backgrounds, different races. I feel that is something that is actually very standing out much more now than in the past. I see that collective, cohesive bond between friends of this generation, and I think the young people are more apt to speak out against things that they feel are just wrong.
Well, thank you, both of you. Anita Bromberg is the Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and Gwyn Chapman is President of the Canadian Black Caucus, a community activist group. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Does faith play a role in healing the issue of racism? And where does God fall on the issue of race? Earlier, I sat down with Calvin Quarles. He's the pastor of Bolingbrook Church in Chicago, Illinois. After news of the shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina hit, he was there to help and find out what could change. Take a look. Pastor Calvin, you have been on the ground with this wonderful, beautiful church that was really created as a safe place. The AME denomination was there to make it safe for Black people to feel they could worship God.
Absolutely.
And we still have what Martin Luther King described as the most racially segregated hour in America. Could say it here in Canada as well. Why are we worshiping apart our different races?
Yeah, that's probably one of the most significant challenges that the church is facing. I do believe that we are trying to move in the direction of having multicultural ministries and trying to address the issue. But racism is such a powerful enemy of the body of Christ and an enemy in our communities at large. So it really does come to a point in place where something different has to happen. And I think that's why when I look at Charleston, it sent a different message to me about what was taking place. You would have expected that hate would have rose up in there and anger would have come forward more than anything else. But as a result of what we saw, there was really a focus on love, kindness, forgiveness, and how do we extend that forgiveness to
Some
others.
people thought the forgiveness was too fast.
Yeah.
Tell us about forgiveness here in Charleston.
Yeah, so it really, I think that we're required to do it, first of all, so it really should not have been a
the
shock.
Christian
Yeah, it
gift.
should not have been a shock to those of us in the church. But even for myself, to see it happen in the manner in which it happened, in the way it happened, in the way in which they responded. I was meeting with another friend of mine who's a pastor in California, and he said to me, he says, Cal, I don't think I could have responded that way. He says, it really would have been a struggle for me. Personally, I know I would like to think that I would do the right thing and that I'd come back with the proper response. That was a significant challenge.
You've lived this. You didn't experience racism as a young child, but as a growing adult,
Yes.
you tucked your passion for racial justice into the Black Panthers.
Yes.
That group was busted up by the FBI. Then you joined the Nation of Islam.
Yes.
What kind of battle were you fighting?
Well, for me, it was very much of a personal issue. I'd say that more than it being a hate issue, it was probably more like the first law of nature, self-preservation. I was 14 years old in 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated. So my life shifted then significantly, just seeing what was happening around the way in which African Americans were being treated. I had a number of friends, older friends, that were going off to the Vietnam War and what was happening with Vietnam.
But it's a massive change to go from those activist groups
Yes.
to being a unifying pastor.
Yes.
That's coming
yes.
along, funding a creation of forgiveness.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, without a doubt, the advent of Christ in my life, I had been raised as a child in the church, and so had some background with that relationship. On one occasion when I was, as a member of the Nation of Islam, I was sitting in a meeting, and there was a statement made by the leader of the Nation of Islam at that time at the meeting we were attending in Chicago. He made the statement that if the church, the Catholic Church, the Baptists, the Protestants, whoever is looking for the return of Christ, tell them that Christ has returned in the person of Wallace D. Muhammad. That turned me around. I got literally upset with being there. I had not joined because of that. I had joined because I wanted to be a part of something that was going to be protecting the African American people, not because I wanted to change my faith or put my faith in a man. So when I heard that statement, I said, okay, I'm gone in the wrong direction. Now, at what point do I begin to turn back? So I, at that point, packed up. I was living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time. Packed up, moved back to Chicago area, to Joliet, Illinois, actually. Met with the senior pastor of the church that I had been a child in. He and I got together, and life just began to change for me. The Jesus story tells us to love thy neighbor. And so for me, that says then that I've got a requirement placed on me to share that love, to show that love, to be an example of love, even when it hurts. And I think that's the challenge that most of us have, is that we want to put that to the side when pain enters in. And what we saw in the life of Dr. King and what we saw in the life of others, and when I look at Nelson Mandela, I see where they've allowed themselves to go through pain and still come out with the same response that Christ gave us, and that was that we're to love one another. And so the challenge for us as the church is to be that example to the world that love wins. In the end, love wins.
Well, Pastor Calvin Quarles of Bolingbrook Church, you're the senior pastor there. It's been quite a journey for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our question for you at home is this: how should Canada promote a greater sense of racial inclusion? We want to know what you think. Give us an answer by any of the means you see there on the screen. You can give us a call at 1-800-215-4913. You can also write to us at comments@contextwithlorna.com. Join the conversation as well on Facebook and Twitter at Context TV. So let us know, what's your advice? How should Canada promote a greater sense of racial inclusion?
After the break, I share some closing thoughts on finding hope in racial healing. The problem of racism is a serious one. You know it exists, but you can't quite see it, you can't feel it. But you do know its effect when you're at the Winnipeg National Summit on Racism, which called our country to attention on a systemic problem. We see it across border lines to our neighbors to the south in the horrific acts as the mass murder shooting in Charleston. And what's so important to remember is that race should not exist to separate us, but instead to unite us. It's an idea modeled in Scripture. In Acts 2 and in Revelations of the Bible, differing language and races are all united through the gift of Jesus. Every tongue, every tribe, keeping its distinct differences, but all in harmony through the great equalizer given, Jesus. One people under God. When we truly live by that principle, racial healing and reconciliation can take place. We'd love to hear your stories on racial issues that you've encountered in Canada. It's been quite a season, bringing it into the election and other issues, but we'd love to hear what you've learned about racism and your advice on going forward. For all of us, I'm Lorna Duick. Thanks for watching, and join us next week as we explore life beyond the headlines.
Well, the great niqab debate was back in the news again. Should a Muslim woman be allowed to wear a face covering at her Canadian citizenship ceremony? Well, Richard Handler, the stubborn agnostic, asks, what's the big deal? Could it be that the garment is just a piece of cloth? Well, when comedian John Oliver's video criticizing televangelists went viral, I couldn't resist responding. What is it that makes us so vulnerable to these schemes? And how can we be vigilant while respecting what's sacred? Take a look at this. John, I believe there's even something bigger that you didn't tap on, something that you actually missed that really has to be brought to attention. What is it about us, humanity, people, everyday people walking down the street, that makes us suckers so gullible to these types of messages? Pollyanna Reed shared her inspiring story of overcoming abuse and mental health issues in a recent episode of Context. We recently followed up with her book called Everything I Couldn't Tell My Mother. Well, you can find all that and more all on Context online at contextwithlornaduick.com.